Thursday, March 21st of 1991, a young boy and his family were excited to open up the newest edition of Florida Today, which is a local newspaper in Brevard County in Florida. Junny and his family were not the only ones reading his article. There was an article published by Malcolm Denmark. Now, the previous day, March 20th, there was a kite flying contest that was held at Junny Rios-Martinez's school, his middle school. Now, Junny had spent time, love, pain, tears into creating this kite. And he wanted to submit his kite in for the kite flying contest. Now, Junny, he's 11 years old. Junny's very competitive. He's athletic. He surfs. He plays baseball. He has trophies for both of those things. He loves music. He's very active and he's good. He's good at sports, anything he puts his mind to. So for him, he put blood, sweat, and tears into this kite, and he wanted to submit it. Now, Junny did. He submitted it, and he won. He came in first place. On that same day, Thursday, March 21st, there was a man by the name of Mark Schwab who was actually reading that same Florida Today magazine. Once he flipped to page 15, he saw that picture of Junny holding up his kite. Smiling, handsome boy. And immediately, Mark became enthralled with this picture of Junny. So who is Mark Schwab exactly? Mark Schwab was born December 16th of 1968 in Dover, Ohio. Now, Mark claims that his father was very abusive towards he and his mother. Oftentimes, trying to burn them. He would regularly pull down Mark's pants and point and laugh. Now, after enduring years of abuse, Mark's mother finally left his father and they moved down to Merritt Island, Florida. He attended Merritt Island High School up until the 11th grade, where he dropped out at the age of 17. Now, also at the age of 17 is when his first crime happened. In the fall of 1986, Mark would lure a 14-year-old sophomore from Brevard County into his car under the guise of him needing help with his starter. So this little boy obliged and was getting into the car to help Mark, where Mark would then hold him at knife point and would drive him to a remote area down a dirt path and SA him. So Mark, after the assault happened, Mark threatened this young boy, threatened to hurt his family, threatened to hurt him. And unfortunately, this little boy believed that, and this assault was never reported. It was never found out until further on in the story. In the summer of 1987, an 18-year-old Mark would then go on to commit his second crime. Mark abducted a 13-year-old boy from Cocoa Beach, Florida, after befriending his family. One day, Mark offered to drive this little 13-year-old boy to a painting job for the day. Now imagine you're 13 and you're excited. You're going to go work and make some money, which at 13 you can't get a regular job. So Mark volunteers to take him there. The family agree. They think he's safe and safe hands. So Mark instead takes him to his house, where he ties this little boy up, holds a knife to his throat, and SAs him for the duration of the day. So if you can imagine, they're probably anticipating him being gone 6 to 8 hours, and Mark took advantage of him this whole time. Now, when Mark returned the boy to his family, he tried to bribe him with $200. Please don't tell your family. I will give you $200. And, that's that. However, this young boy bravely told his family what had happened, and Mark was reported the very next day. Mark was being charged with battery and aggravated. So while a conviction would normally be punishable by a sentence not greater than 40 years or life, Mark was actually given a very short sentence. Mark only received a sentence of 8 years and only had to serve 3 years of that sentence. Mark was released on March 4th of 1991, meaning he had only served 3 years out of his 8-year sentence. The rest of his sentence was commuted, and he was instead placed on 15 years of probation. So remember, that was March 4th of 1991 when Mark was released. So just a mere 17 days later, Mark is thumbing through the Florida Today magazine when he comes across that photo of Junny Rios-Martinez. He becomes obsessed with this photo, and he's trying to think of ways that he can lure Junny in. How can he lure this 11-year-old boy in? The very next day, which was Friday, March 22nd of 1991, Mark, after reading the article and seeing the reporter's name, Malcolm Denmark, he called up Junny's house and spoke to Junny's mother and posed as Denmark and said he wanted to do another interview with Junny post the original article. However, Junny was not home at that moment, so his mother had asked Mark, who at the time she thought was Malcolm Denmark, to call later to speak with Junny. So he called back and eventually was able to speak with Junny. And Junny had agreed to do an interview the following day after his baseball practice, I believe it was. So Saturday, March 23rd of 1991, Mark goes to the Rios-Martinez family. He introduces himself as Mark Schwab and says, unfortunately, Malcolm Denmark is unable to attend due to a conflict in his schedule. So he, Mark, would fill in and do this interview himself. Mark was carrying a spiral notebook, and it had all these questions written on the paper, and he had stated that Denmark had prepared it for him and that he would just go down the list of questions for Junny. Now, Mark obviously did not work for this newspaper. He's never worked for any newspaper. In fact, after he had left prison, he started working a job in construction. But Junny and his mother, they had no idea. They trusted this man. So during this interview, Mark sat down on the couch. Junny sat across from him in a rocking chair, and Junny's mother sat right next to Mark. Mark began to ask Junny questions about his school, his grades, the things he'd like to do. He even asked him if there were drugs in the school, if he's encountered any peer pressure. What are your favorite subjects in school? Do you like cars? Junny was so excited to be doing this interview that he left the room and came back with a couple of trophies from baseball games that he's won and from surfing competitions that he's won. And Mark actually looked over to his mother and said, "You must be really proud of him." And his mother said, yes, I am. So after this interview was complete, Mark came prepared with a gift certificate to McDonald's written out to Junny, saying, "To Junny from Mark, Florida Today." So after that interview was over, Mark told Junny's mother that he wanted to do another interview with him and that this could potentially be something national. And he wanted Junny to do an actual photo shoot the following Monday. Junny's mother agreed to it. She had the perfect place. Her husband worked at a club. There were drums there. He could come interview Junny while he was playing the drums. After this interview, he also, knowing that Junny was going to a baseball game, he asked if he could attend this baseball game with them so that he could better get to know the family. So this was Mark's plan of befriending the family, getting them to trust him, to see he's an honest guy with good intentions. So he did. He actually went to Junny's game and sat there for about 30 minutes of this game talking to his mother and father. So the following day, when Mark was supposed to meet up with Junny at his father's club to interview him while he was playing drums, Mark did not show up. In fact, Mark called Junny's mother that evening that he could not make it, and the deadline for that photo shoot had been extended, and the photo shoot would have to be canceled. The following day, that Monday, Mark is still, I imagine, trying to come up with a plan to devise some type of plan on how he can get Junny, but his parents are in the way. Junny's always around his parents. So he's thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? So the next day he calls Junny's mother again. He tells her that he's no longer involved with Florida Today, that local magazine that he first saw Junny in. So he tells her that he's taken a position with a surfing magazine. Surfing magazine. But that's Junny's other passion. So 2 days later, Mark sends an actual letter to the Rios-Martinez family. And this letter would state how wonderful their family is and that they should just be so proud about how close and loving they are. And Miss Rios-Martinez would just be taken aback by this and just so pleased that Mark had noticed this and just proud. So the following Sunday was Easter, and Mark wanted to hand deliver an Easter card to the Rios-Martinez family. So he shows up, and Junny's mom answers the door. He gives her this card, and she informs him that Junny's not there. Her husband is not there either. But they begin talking, and she expresses to him how deeply moved she was by the letter that he had sent earlier. And they just got to talking, and he's really just building that relationship even more. In this short amount of time, too, if you really look at the timeline, he has been able to just befriend this family so quickly. He told her that in doing this, he was actually able to make a lot of new contacts with surfing companies, and that he thought that he could possibly get one of them to sponsor Junny. So 3 days later, Mark contacts Miss Rios-Martinez and tells her that he does have an actual surfing company that is interested in sponsoring Junny. He actually brought a t-shirt with a surfing logo on it, and brought that for Junny, and told Miss Rios-Martinez that she would just need to gather some more photos for him that he could take and bring to the surfing company. Mark also told Junny that he could have whatever surfboard he wanted, and that, in fact, he could design a surfboard and have it. He also said that the company would provide him with his surfing gear, his clothing. All of that would be paid for. So over the next several days, Mark is visiting with the Rios-Martinez family on a regular basis, and he's there often with Junny designing the surfboard, the perfect surfboard, just like the dedication, the blood, sweat, and tears that he was putting in, that he had put in for his kite to win the kite contest. He's now putting in the same effort for a surfboard to be made because he just knew that he could win a competition. He knew it. He had done it in the past. And so this time he was going to be sponsored and actually create his own surfboard. He had also told Mrs. Martinez during this meeting that he had met with the president of the surfing company and he needed to give her these documents. They were forged documents, contracts, for her to sign, giving permission for them to be involved with Junny since he was underage, to be able to do the photos, to give them, design the surfboards and all that stuff that goes along with contracts and working and being sponsored by another company. Mark also gave them a list of tournaments, upcoming tournaments that Junny would be competing in. So during one of the visits, Mark had actually asked for permission from Junny's parents if he could take Junny to Daytona Beach, Florida to meet this surfing business, to meet the president and everyone involved in this company. They agreed, and Mark was supposed to pick up Junny on March 14th, 1991 at 10 a.m. Now, Mark actually called really early that morning and had canceled it. Junny's parents would never hear from Mark again. That would be the last time that they had any contact with Mark. So Thursday, April 18th, 1991, around 7 a.m., Junny's leaving his house and making his way to his sixth grade class at Clear Lake Middle School. He has a baseball game this day. He's probably excited or maybe nervous about it. It's probably what he's thinking about. So around 2:15 that day, a bookkeeper at the school takes a phone call from a man purporting to be Junny's father and says, I need to get a message to Junny. I need Junny to not get on the bus today. I need him to meet me by the baseball fields, and I will pick him up. So this bookkeeper contacted Junny's classroom and did actually called Junny into the office. And when Junny got there, she did say, your father called. I spoke with him. You are not to take the bus home today. He will meet you at the baseball fields. At about 3 p.m. That same day, while Junny knows he's supposed to meet his father by the baseball field, he is walking from school with a classmate towards that field. The classmate says that Junny jumped over the fence into the baseball field. And another classmate said he saw Junny with a tall guy who had gotten out of a U-Haul pickup truck. A short while later, that friend would then say that the U-Haul truck was gone and Junny was gone too. Junny's baseball game started at 6:30. Now, Junny's mother would end up arriving at the baseball field at around 7 o'clock. She didn't see Junny. She did see Junny's dad, who was there, who also was just as confused as her because neither one of them could find Junny. So she immediately left the baseball field and drove home to see if Junny was at their house. Junny wasn't home. So she immediately called Mark, thinking that maybe Mark had known. And the phone number that Mark had provided her with, she was not able to get through to him. So later that evening, when Junny had never showed up, they haven't heard from Mark. They haven't heard from anybody about him. They went ahead and reported Junny as missing to the police. April 19th, 1991, which was a Friday, Mark learns from his mother that the police had come around to the apartment that he shared with her and that they were looking for him to question him about a missing child. So about 45 minutes after getting off the phone with his mom, he decides to call her back and says that he is going to meet with his probation officer and have a conversation with his probation officer. Now, why he did this, why he said that, who knows what his intentions were, if it was his way of saying that he had been involved in this and needed to get direction from his probation officer. Who knows? Instead of actually going to his probation officer, Mark decides to call his aunt in Port Washington, Ohio, which is over 1,000 miles away from Cocoa Beach. So Mark proceeds to tell his aunt that a man by the name of Donald held him at knife point and forced him to abduct a little boy by the name of Junny. He then said that Donald threatened to kill him and his mother if he didn't SA Junny. So the next day on April 21st, Miss Kinsey, who is Mark's aunt, actually was visited by police officers who were looking for some sort of connection between the missing boy from Cocoa Beach, Florida. And while they were actually there at her house, her phone rings and it's Mark. So after that conversation, Miss Kinsey agrees that if the police officers want to come back later, she can set up this phone call and they can actually, I guess, tap the phone to find Mark's location. So Mark took the bait and he calls back later and they find out where he's at. He was actually a short distance away in Ohio from just down the road from his aunt's house. So he was arrested. He was taken into custody. So once Mark was arrested, he gave a voluntary statement. Mark said that a man named Donald confronted him outside of a bar at about 2 a.m. on the Sunday before Junny disappeared. So that was April 14th, 1991. That was the day he was supposed to take Junny to Daytona Beach. So this man threatened Mark that he would get Mark sent back to prison. On Monday, April 15th, Mark receives a phone call, he says. He says that there was a man who was threatening to frame him for SAing a boy unless Mark bought a motorcycle for another man. So because of these two threats, Mark rented a U-Haul truck. He did this to look less conspicuous. Then he checked himself into a motel in Cocoa Beach. Thursday, April 18th, Donald accosted him at a restaurant near the motel and forced Mark into his car at gunpoint. Now, this is the story Mark is telling. Donald drove him to a field and threatened to kill his mother if Mark didn't do everything he was told. Donald then drove them both to a payphone where Donald used it to call Junny's school, pretending to be Mr. Rios-Martinez and leaving a message that Junny should go to the baseball field after school. So after Donald made this call, he then told Mark that he needed to get back to the U-Haul and better bring him back some kid or his mother would be unalived. So Mark immediately drove this U-Haul to Junny's middle school, and that was his plan, to get Junny into his vehicle and bring this guy to Donald. So what I am reading is actually their transcripts from the court hearings and the things that were going on and court documents. So this is what Mark is purporting. Mark claims that shortly after he returned to his motel room that Donald entered the room, locked the door behind him, and drew his gun and told Mark, "Now I got you, you son of a bitch." Donald then used duct tape to bind Junny's hands behind his back and a knife to cut off his clothes. When Junny started to cry, Donald struck him a couple of times with his gun and taped his mouth shut. Mark then said that Donald forced him to SA Junny. Mark then told officers that Donald had instructed him to leave him at the hotel room by himself with Junny and that he needed to get lost for a few hours. And then Mark, I guess, had returned earlier than what was expected, and Donald told him to retrieve a footlocker, which I didn't know what a footlocker was. I had to look it up, and apparently it is like a big trunk. And so he was instructed to pick this up and then told to leave for a little while longer. So Mark says that once he returned 5 to 6 hours later, that Donald was nowhere to be found and Junny was nowhere to be found. So officers returned Mark to Florida on April 23rd, 1991. Now, while traveling with the police, Mark said he wanted to look for Junny's body. So for several hours during this overcast, rainy day, Mark is essentially leading police officers to all different kinds of areas. He's obviously pretending to have some sort of idea or speculate where Donald may have taken Junny to. So around 10 p.m., Mark led the officers to a largely underdeveloped part of Brevard County. And once there, Mark walked down an unpaved road, stopped, began pacing back and forth, and then he points into the woods. The search team crossed a drainage ditch and walked into the woods in the direction Mark had pointed. Not far from the road, they saw a small footlocker, so that trunk, tied nearly shut, not quite closed, with rope, and there was palm fronds that were covered it. So palm trees, their leaves that fall off, they're kind of big, and he just kind of laid them across it to conceal it. So even from 10 feet away, the team could tell from the smell that a human body was inside. It'd been 5 days since Junny was last seen. The footlocker they had gathered up and they took it to the medical examiner's office where it was examined. When the ropes were cut, there was a blanket inside that had several stains on it. Under the blanket was a small boy's naked body in a semi-fetal position. His face was not recognizable because of the decomposition that had occurred over those 5 days, but through fingerprints, the body was identified as Junny Rios-Martinez, the missing boy. Also found inside the footlocker were a pair of shoes, socks, underwear, shorts, a shirt, a watch, a yellow medal, a gold chain, 2 towels, some pieces of wadded duct tape, and a manila folder. Miss Rios-Martinez identified the clothing and jewelry items belonging to her son, some of the clothing she had just bought him for Easter. The gold chain was also a family heirloom that Junny's father, Mr. Rios-Martinez, had gifted him. The medical examiner's autopsy report stated that Junny had died from mechanical asphyxiation from either smothering or strangulation. Despite the decomposition of the body, there were signs of possible bruising that would be that would correlate with someone who was SA'd. Also to be found in one of those wadded up pieces of the duct tape, Mark's fingerprints were on there. When they searched Mark's car, it revealed a Kmart receipt for that footlocker, and that was dated April 18th, 1991, which was the day Junny was abducted. Mark was purchasing this footlocker. It premeditated this 100%. There was no Donald. No doubt. There was no Donald. So after the body was found, Mark changed his story and stated Donald forced he and Junny both into the U-Haul after the SA occurred. Now, right as soon as the body's found, Mark starts changing his story. He's stating that Donald forced he and Junny both into the U-Haul after the SA occurred. He stated that Donald drove them around to various locations near Cocoa while discussing where he could dump Junny's body. And then once all three were back at the motel, Donald told Mark to get lost and to not come back for several hours. When he came back the next morning, he saw Donald carrying the black footlocker, which Donald handed to Mark and then ordered him to leave again. So the state, after hearing all of this on trial, the judge rejected Mark's story about another man being involved and found that Mark had indeed acted alone. Donald did not exist. On May 15th, 1991, Mark pleaded not guilty to the charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and SAing of a child, and he waived his right to a jury trial. May 22nd, 2001, Mark was convicted of all charges. July 1st, 2001, Mark receives a sentencing of death. Now, during this time, there was a lot of stuff that was going on where lethal injection, I guess something had happened with 3 other prior inmates who had received death sentences and were dying by injection, lethal injection. And something happened, I guess, to these 3 guys during that time where they actually stopped doing lethal injection. So Mark sat for a while in prison on death row. And during this time, he tried to appeal, I guess, the judgment for the death penalty. Of course, they never did that, and he carried on. And so once they did bring back lethal injection, it wasn't until July 1st, which was 7 years to the day after his original sentencing, that he was put to death by lethal injection. His very last meal, this is the very last thing he ever ate. His last meal was 2 fried eggs, 4 strips of bacon, 2 sausage links, hash browns, buttered toast, and a quart of chocolate milk. When they asked him if he had any final words, Mark declined. He had nothing to say, no remorse, nothing to the family. So Junny's family sat back and they witnessed Mark take his final breaths. Unfortunately, that's not enough to bring back their Junny. It's been well over 30 years, 30 plus years since this occurred and this happened to Junny. And, his parents had to endure life without this young boy who was just the light of their life. And all they have left are photos and trophies. And unfortunately, this is a situation where the justice system failed. They let this predator free. After 3 years of knowing someone who was capable of, at such a young age, kidnapping a child and just being a predator. And because of this, they were able to pass, says here, this case led to the passage of the Junny Rios-Martinez Jr. Act of 1992, which prohibits those convicted of sexual battery from receiving early releases in the state of Florida. Thankfully, that came out of this whole thing. But unfortunately, I think that even with other cases, there are times where inmates are released, whether it's murder, things like that, and they get right back on the street and they do it again. And the justice system fails people then too. So, but yes, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this. This is my first video. My name is Candy Perry, and I love all things crime. And I hope to be back with some other stories to tell. So if you like this, please click, motherfucker. Just, if you liked it, click the buttons, do your thing.